off their mortgage, paid it all off, you know, you're scot-free, you don't know anything. Thank you. Thank you to all the renters because you guys are subsidizing my mortgage. I really appreciate that. And I got a big mortgage because I want maximum tax deduction. But that's, you know, that makes financial sense, right? Because they're incentivizing us to take big mortgages, and that gets us into the mortgage market, which is heavily regulated, right? We've got these entities out there called Freddie and Fannie and FHA and all these other government entities created in order to encourage us to take on mortgages, to subsidize them, to make them as cheap as possible for all of us, whether we can afford it or not. And when you look at Freddie and Fannie, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and you look at what happened to them, the size they got to before this financial crisis, the kind of incentives they were providing for everybody to own a home, particularly low income. But really everybody, because they only subsidize housing below, in those days, $450,000. Now it's $750,000. In California, $450,000 is pretty low income for a home. Trillions of dollars, subsidies for people to own homes. That's not a free market. There wasn't a free market in mortgages when you've got basically a government-backed entity subsidizing mortgages. And there are a lot of other tax advantages. There are a variety of different insurance schemes that the government runs in order to encourage us to buy homes. And then the one I think that it literally is the funniest one is this notion that banks function in a free market. I don't know how many of you know anything about banks. I happen to have done, as a finance professor, a lot of my research on banks and have invested in banks for many, many years. And this idea that banks are somehow unregulated is one of the most ludicrous statements ever made. Banks are the most regulated industry in the United States. The most. When you start a bank, you have to get approval from the regulators for your business plan, for your management team, for who provides you with the capital, who gives you the money in order to help start a bank. For the first few years that you run the bank, regulators are in your offices on a quarterly basis. Every major decision you make has to be approved by the regulators. And even when you're a big bank and you want to hire a CEO, that has to be approved by regulators. Or invent a new type of financial instrument, has to be approved by the regulators. Or increase your leverage, has to be approved by the regulators. If in this country today, high tech is, let's say, 70–80% free of regulations and government controls and 20% controlled, banking is 80% regulated and controlled and 20% free. So, there's no question that something failed. But to claim that the free market failed is just ludicrous, because there was no free market. And if you look at these industries that collapsed and did so much damage, they're all heavily regulated industries. They're all industries in which the government has a heavy hand, heavy involvement. Yet why is it that we automatically blame free markets? You know, maybe the most significant way in which the government intervenes in these markets, and particularly with banks, is that the products banks deal with is money. Yet who controls money? Banks don't. The Federal Reserve does. It controls the money supply. It controls, through that, it controls interest rates. The Federal Reserve is at the heart of this. And if you look at this crisis, anybody, I think, any economist who's honest and looks at this crisis and doesn't see the Federal Reserve written all over it, from beginning to end, is just evading the facts. Every time the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates to below the rate of inflation and keeps it there, what happens? So, between 2002 and 2005, the rate of interest rates were below the rate of inflation. We call that in finance a negative real rate of return. What happens when you have a negative real rate of return? It incentivizes us to do what? When interest rates are really, really, really low. What does it incentivize us to borrow? And we all did. We all borrowed, right? Some of you are too young to borrow, but all of us who are old enough to borrow, borrowed. We borrowed on our credit card. We borrowed on our homes. We borrowed on our businesses. Because, you know, to some extent, you had to be dumb not to borrow. It was so damn cheap. You know, interest rates at the time were 1%. Well, today they're 0. But they were 1%. Inflation was 3%. You could buy, you could borrow at 1%. You know, there are plenty of assets that match inflation, like housing typically matches inflation. So surprise, surprise, people borrowed at low interest rates and bought homes, bought cars, bought lots of things. But that was the Federal Reserve setting the interest rate, not the free market. The free market doesn't set interest rates. The Fed does. And it's fascinating because there's pretty much an understanding in economics and among the public and even politicians to some extent, that fixing prices, you know, that you take the price of tomatoes, or you take the price of homes, or you take the price of anything, you fix it. What happens? You know, we learned this from the Soviet Union and all the experiments over the last 100 years of socialism. When you fix a price, does the bureaucrat ever get that price right? No, and I would argue he can't. Because prices mean that interaction that is created between supply and demand. If you take supply and demand out of it and just give it to some bureaucrat, any price they pick is wrong. Now, if they pick a price that's lower than what the market would have set it at, what happens? Everybody wants to buy the stuff. Nobody wants to produce it, right? Because they can't make any money on it. It's too low. If he sets the price too high, everybody wants to produce it. Nobody wants to buy it. And if you go back and you look at socialist experiments, or even in the U.S. when Nixon froze prices in the 1970s, and this has even been tried here, it never, ever, ever works. And this is stuff that's taught in Econ 101. Everybody knows it. So nobody in this country anymore talks about fixing the price of wheat. Or something. You know, so once in a while somebody will talk about oil, because oil is a particularly evil product, so it's okay to fix its price. But there's one thing that we all care about price fixing. Probably the most complex price in our entire economy, where we really need supply and demand. And that's interest rates. Because interest rates should be determined by the supply of money and the demand of money. The supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. That should set an interest rate. And yet, we ignore markets when it comes to interest rates. It's okay for 12 guys to meet once a quarter. Maybe, I think there's one woman there. Anyway, 12 guys, sometimes with PhDs, sometimes not, to meet and fix the price of interest rates. That's okay. Somehow that's become an acceptable thing, even in a world in which we understand that price fixing is bad. The bureaucrats determining prices is bad. For interest rates, we're fine. So when the Federal Reserve sets the price of interest, price of money, too low, demand goes way up. It's the price of price. Demand to borrow. Okay, so, you know, I don't think this is hard. I really don't. This is not hard stuff. If you look at the facts, it's pretty straightforward. So the real question that I think we, or those of us who care about capitalism, really need to grapple with is, why is it that clearly the facts are on our side? And I'd be happy to answer questions in the Q&A for those of you who want to challenge those facts. Clearly the facts